Welcome everyone to this second in the series of 4 webinars that the EQUATOR Network is producing alongside AH Editing. I'm Jen, I'm here at the University of Oxford, as Mike said, from the EQUATOR Network. And you are joining us to learn about how to write fantastic health research articles that are fit for purpose, useful for your readers. And we're in our second webinar today. Last time we talked about what made a fantastic research article, and we talked about those tools called reporting guidelines. Today we are planning your writing. We are planning before you start to write. And as Mike mentioned, we have a Q&A session at the end. We're going to take a couple of minutes to look at your questions. Any questions as we go along, pop them into the comment box and we'll keep track of them as we go along. So let's get going. First question, some of you are going, why? Why are we spending one of our 4 precious sessions talking about planning? Well, the reality is journal articles tend to be written primarily by one person, but based on work by a whole team working together. And if you start writing without getting a serious, proper, concrete plan in place with your team, things can go quite wrong along the way. It makes the writing process really quite tortured and challenging. All of those changes of directions, co-authors get very confused, they see a first draft, it was not what they were expecting, and the final product, you can end up in a bit of a dead end. That's not what you want from your writing process. You want to end up with a manuscript at the end that everybody's happy with, and you want it to happen quickly and efficiently. And the way that works, start with a solid plan that everyone's agreed on before you even get going, and then you will end up with a manuscript very quickly by the end that everyone's super happy with exactly what they were expecting. And because you've written it with such a solid plan and a clear goal in mind, journal editors are going to really appreciate these manuscripts. It's going to be a coherent, solid piece. What we're going to be focusing on from a planning perspective is things like messaging and audience and medium. We're going to talk about author lists, since that can be contentious. And we're going to look at how you can identify your target journal. And then lastly, wrapping it all up, getting ready to write. So, are you ready to get a solid plan in place? Let's get going with defining the message, the audience, and the medium. So, the message. What is your message? We don't always take the time to do this. Think about your latest research study. If I met you in an elevator and we had just the duration of that ride, can you tell me your message in 2 to 5 sentences? Can you tell me your message? Like quite literally, write it down, right? Don't just do it out loud. Grab a piece of paper, grab a Word document, and let's write down your plan. We fail to do this quite often. We fail to sort of sit down and think, what is the point of what I'm doing? What is my message? So what am I trying to do? How am I doing it? What did I find? That's my message, wrapped up in 2 to 5 sentences. Write it down. Because what you think is your message might be very different from what your co-author thinks is your message. Next up, audience. Who needs to hear that message? Have a think. Is it a very general audience? Are we talking every single medical professional in the world? Or are we getting quite specific? Does this need to be read by GPs in the UK, cardiologists in China, research nurses in Africa? Who needs to read this message? Who needs it? You can have more than one audience. And for each of those audiences, what do you want them to do with your message? Do you want them to do some further research? In which case, what is that research? Do they need to validate your study? Are we ready for a systematic review? What's next? What's the next step? Or do you want them to totally change their practice right now? Is that the point of this message? Stop doing this thing, start doing this other thing, right? You know what I'm going to say? Write it down. Write it down in your plan. So write down who your audience is, could be more than one audience, write down what you want them to do. And then thinking about the medium. For us, this is going to be less of an issue because we're talking about journal articles. But you may find when you've written down your message and your audience and what you want them to do, that the journal article is not the only medium that makes sense. It's possible that you need something in addition, say a patient information sheet, say a social media campaign. Your message needs to get out there in some way. What is the best way to reach that audience? But let's focus in on the journal article because you're typically going to be writing the journal article. Fantastic. There are 3 big types of journal articles. Things like preliminary outputs, so that's abstracts for conferences that will end up getting published in a proceedings. Things like primary research, case studies, qualitative research, quantitative research, RCT, and economic evaluation. And then there's secondary articles, which is when you've taken existing research and you're saying something about it. You're making a review, you're maybe writing a letter about an article, you're giving a commentary. So, what kind of article are you writing? Is an article the right thing for you? Should you be writing something as well? But again, let's write it down. What kind of publication are you writing? Is it secondary? Is it primary? What kind of primary? This is all going to be really important. Keep writing it down. Keep going back to that plan. Right, so we've defined what we want, what our message is, what our audience is, and where we're going to be sending out that message. Who's involved? Who's going to be involved in this paper now? And I'm going to focus, get quite medical, quite health research for a moment, because the authorship criteria that the ICMJE produce is fantastic. There might be something more specific to your field, but this is a good start place. Right, so authorship criteria. Step 1, substantial contribution, right? To either the conception or the design of the work. So that's the person who came up with the big idea or figured out how to do the study, how to attack that idea. Or to the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data. So that's the people who went out and did the study, collected that data, and then figured out what it meant. To be an author, you need to have made a substantial contribution to one of those 2 elements, or both, but at least one of those elements. But that's not all. You also need to have either drafted the work, be the person who's written that first draft, or you need to be someone who is critically revising, editing, working with that document. That's when you send around a draft and your co-authors comment and say, well, this isn't working, this is, write a bit here, critically revising. That's not all. There's a 3rd criteria, final approval. To be a co-author, you need to see every single version that gets sent into a journal, every single version. And you need, whoopsie, that jumped one slide, there we go. You also need to agree to be accountable for the work. Can you stand by this paper if there is a future notice of concern or retraction? Can you stand by this work? So, 4 criteria to make you an author. You can't be an author unless you stand in each of these blocks, right? You need to have had a substantial contribution, you need to have been involved in creating the paper, you need to approve that paper, and you need to stand by the work. Now, what if somebody has made those substantial contributions? You can't take away their possibility of being an author by not giving them the option to be involved in the writing. So if somebody, once you're sitting with your message, if somebody made substantial contributions to creating that message, you need to give them the option of being involved in the drafting and in the revising to become an author. However, if someone doesn't want to do that, or they're only involved in drafting or in editing, say as a medical writing professional, That means no authorship. The thing about these recommendations is we don't want to hide people's contributions. No ghosts. So if someone has hit one of those criteria, but not the others, tell us about them in your acknowledgements. No ghosts. Similarly, no guests. If someone hasn't actually hit all of those criteria, they don't count as an author. So that's where you get your author list. We want to acknowledge those who don't meet the authorship criteria, but all of those who meet the authorship criteria need to be on your list. You know what I'm going to say next? Write it down. Write down who your author list is, right? And write down who of that list is actually acknowledgements. So you've got your author list. What about your target journal? You want to choose a target journal before you start to write. Every journal has such different requirements. There is no point in writing a draft and getting to the end and then needing to change it completely to suit the journal you're going for. So you may write your message and realize this is a commentary or a research short communication. It's only 1,300 words. What's the point of having written a 6,000 word article, right? So we want to know what we're writing before we start. There are 4 major criteria when choosing a journal. And the first one is that it is real. Some of you are thinking, what? Of course it has to be a real journal. There are things called predatory journals out there. These are journals that claim to be an academic journal, but aren't. These are online spaces that will open access publish your publication, but they won't be found by anyone. It won't get the real peer review it needs, and it won't be indexed in the places where you find your work, in which case it's as good as you posting your work on your private blog. That's it. So your precious research that you've dedicated so much time, so much energy to, it needs to go into a real solid, proper journal. What are some warning signs that something's not a real journal? Who here has had the direct email? Throw your stories in the comment box. I'd love to hear them. Who here has had that direct email? It goes, "Dear Dr. So-and-so, we're having a special issue on a field completely unrelated to what you do. We want your paper. Send it in within the next week. It'll be published within the next 3 weeks. It's going to be amazing." Massive red flag. Unless you are doing Nobel Prize winning work right now that people know about, direct emails, super big red flags, right? Very low cost. We know open access costs money. If the cost is dramatically lower than the industry standard, it's a red flag. We'll publish your paper for $200. Red flag. One of these red flags on their own, probably fine. It's when they start adding up. Super fast peer review time. Send us your article. It'll be online within 2 weeks. Peer review takes time. Think about when you peer review, how much time and energy it takes. Think about how busy you are, how hard it is to fit that dedicated time to spend that 3-4 hours with an article. You can't turn that around in a week, can you? Where are these peer reviewers coming from that they can turn around an article like that, right? Red flag. And then if you do send it in and it does get peer reviewed and it comes back with like no comments, this article's amazing, publish immediately. Even when we are seriously senior authors and we've written hundreds of papers, we're still never going to be perfect. From peer review, we want comments, we want serious criticism, we want our study picked apart and thought about. If there's no comments, did they really peer review? These are all red flags. And a lot of you are now going to say, ooh, I'd really like a list, a white list and a black list. Which are the safe journals? Which are the not safe journals? The problem is journals change. Something that could have been good might no longer be. Something that was bad, maybe improving their practice. Legitimate journals quite often get sold and maybe picked up by a predatory publisher. So rather than say, oh, sorry, if it sounds too good to be true with any of these issues, they probably are, right? They probably are too good to be true. So taking you back to how to figure this out. There is a fantastic checklist by an organization called Think, Check, Submit. The link is on your screen right now. They have a checklist of questions that you can work through to figure out whether a journal is legit or predatory. Work through when you're thinking about a journal, especially if it's a journal you've never heard of. Right. So you're using Think, Check, Submit. You're going to be sure that any journal you send to is definitely a real journal. The first major criteria for picking a journal is the clinical or academic specialty. How do you even start? First of all, think about where your current literature is sitting. Think about your reference list that you're reading right now to get into your study. Where are those papers cited? Think about your collaborators, your supervisor, and your competitors. Where are they publishing? Think about that article that you read and went, ah, wish I had written that. Where is that published? And draw up a bit of a long list and have a look at each one, go to the journal page and read the scope and aims. Is it going to work for you? Read through each scope and aims. You're thinking here about the publication type. Do they actually publish your kind of paper? A lot of journals say don't publish qualitative or don't publish case reports. Have a look in that list. Which of these journals articles does the message fit their scope and aims, and do they actually publish your kind of publication? And then we're going to narrow that list a bit. So we're going to be thinking about our audience and what our audience we want the audience to do. Thinking about these things, which of these journals will work for us? Who from our audience is reading which of these journals on our list? We want to think about where our audience is in the world, right? Do we need to get really specific? If we want to be reaching, say, doctors in South Africa, do we want to focus on the South African Medical Journal? If we want to reach doctors globally, do we want to be focusing on one of the big general medical journals? That kind of thing. You want to think as well when you're sort of going, oh, I really want to go for that really big journal, that really big general journal. They might have a much bigger readership than your small specialist journal. But think about, of their readership, how much is your audience? How much is your audience? Because if the audience proportion is really small, maybe you are better off with that smaller journal where a higher proportion of the people in that journal are going to read this article because it's in their wheelhouse. It's what they are interested in. And then there's a few other little issues that come into maybe you or your co-author has strong feelings on particular issues in how publication happens. For example, peer review. Do you feel strongly about single blind peer review, where you don't know who the review is, but they know who you are? Double blind peer review, where neither of you know who each other is. And then there's open peer review, where both you and the reviewer know who the other is, and on top of that, the reviews often get published. Is this something you feel strongly about? Only you know, right? So you've got a bit of a short list now. How are you going to pick the target journal? You might need to be thinking about career requirements for yourself and your co-authors. And it's usually a balancing act between timing and prestige. So by timing, I mean you may have a graduate student that needs a publication to graduate. You don't have time to go through multiple rounds of possible rejections, in which case maybe you need to look at a journal that has a bias towards acceptance, not rejection. Or maybe you've got time, you could do a couple of rounds and you could try those harder to get into journals first. Maybe you've got time. The other issue is prestige. Maybe one of your co-authors is on tenure track. and needs a really quality journal publication in order to take that next step in their career. And they're prepared to wait for those few months or even a year to go through multiple journals. In which case, how you judge journal quality is going to come down to things like the community vibe. What does your research community feel about particular journals? Which are the good journals? And I'm going to just stop and mention impact factor quickly. Impact factor is one way that people use to judge the quality of a journal. It just measures citation numbers. And the issue with it is try not to rely on it entirely. Try not to just say, oh, this is the highest impact factor journal in our field. We should go for that one. Think about all of these other criteria we've been talking about. Impact factor is just a journal level measure. It doesn't tell you how good an individual article is, and it just measures citations. And there are other metrics available that you can look at that are article level, and they measure attention. So there are other things you can be looking at to measure the quality of a journal. Try not to get too hung up on just impact factor. So you've figured out which is the good journals for you. There's one last thing to think about, which is your funders and your institute. Write your acknowledgments section now. Each of your co-authors, who do they have to acknowledge? Who are their funders? Who are their institutes that they need to acknowledge? The reason you need to do this is some of the funders require you to publish in a particular way. Some funders will require you to publish open access in a particular way. And you need to check that the journal you're going for does actually offer these routes that you have to use. So write that down now, figure it out so that you know you won't get caught much later. You've been accepted and oh no, it doesn't meet what my funder wants me to do. Okay, so that's our acknowledgements. You want to get that written now, and our target journal. And guess what? We're writing it in the plan. So we've got a really solid plan now. This is awesome. We've defined our message, our audience, we've got our author list, we've got our target journal ready. Are we ready to write? Well, we've got this amazing plan. Now we need to make sure everybody's on board. All of your co-authors on board and signed off, because you want everyone to have agreed to the plan up front so they could figure it out whether they're happy with your message and such now, before you start writing. So send out the plan. Send out the plan to the team. When everybody agrees and everyone's on board, great, you've got it in writing. That's what you want. Now you've got one last step before you can start writing. There's a couple of more tools that you need, and that's instructions for authors and reporting guidelines. So go back to your target journal and check what your publication type is and check out their instructions for authors. We're bad about this as authors, about reading instructions for authors in detail, but the instructions for authors are a wealth of information for you. They've got things like the word count, they've got things like what the article sections are they're going to want, the big headings, and then issues like data sharing requirements, study registration requirements, ethics approval requirements, all of this information that you need before you can start to write. So get all of that down, and then reporting guidelines will give you even more detail of the subheadings that you might want to use in your article, and also the detail that you're going to need to be able to write. Because there's nothing more frustrating than starting to write and realizing, actually, I have half the information I need. So if you can't remember how to find the right reporting guideline for your study, check out our first webinar from 2 weeks ago. We've got the link up there. It's available to watch on AH Editing's Facebook page. And that will explain to you in detail how to find the right reporting guideline. And just come and visit equatornetwork.org, and there's all the information there. So make your list of the missing information and then send it out to your co-authors and wait for them to come back to you with all of that information that you need. You're ready to go now. Now you have all of the information that you need so that you can start to write that rough draft. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next week. How to write a rough draft from start to finish, what journals expect from you in each of those sections, and what the best order to write in is. And because writing and editing, two totally separate processes, where then the following week, 5th of December, our last webinar, we're going to be talking about how to polish up your language to get you tightly within that word count so you don't have issues and you can fit in all the information that you need to. So at the end of this series of 4 webinars, you're going to feel confident writing articles that are simple, clear, and complete so that your readers can read them easily, understand them easily, and most importantly, use them because it's got all the information that they need. So, any questions about the planning process? We've got 5 minutes. So I'm just going to wait for my colleague Caroline has a little list of our questions as we've been going along. Fantastic. So question 1, would my supervisor automatically be the first author even if it was my idea? Good question. This is a conversation to be had before you even start the research. When you have the idea and you're starting to plan the study and you're starting to plan who's going to do what, have that conversation. Is what I'm doing sufficient to be first author or to be senior author, last author, or to even gain authorship? Before you start the work, you want to have that conversation. And typically, if you haven't had that conversation and you're having it now before you start to write, the person who writes the article, who did the work and now writing the article, is typically the first author. The supervisor tends not to take first authorship if the student has done the majority of the work and written the article. The reality is, if you've done a very small part of the work, that was the supervisor's big idea, and your supervisor takes over writing, they're probably going to be first author. But this is a conversation to be had the whole way through your process. Don't wait until you have a final draft ready to submit to have this conversation. Have it when you start the research, have it before you start writing. Keep having that conversation, right? Hope that helps. Okay, question 2, how can you sort out disagreements on which journal to target? Another great question. This is one of those issues where working through why you've chosen each journal is really helpful. You want to talk to your co-authors as to why they believe what they believe, why they have wanted this particular journal. Because as I said, somebody may be trying to balance a serious career requirement or have a serious timing issue. So you want to know upfront why it is we want to go for each journal so that everybody can advocate for their journals. And when you've written down clearly your message and your audience, and you've written down clearly what kind of article you're writing, and you're going back to those scopes and aims inside the journal, it becomes a lot clearer what needs to happen. If you have a major disagreement and it comes down to 2 or 3 journals, what you could do is have a look at which is the most prestigious in your field and go for that one first, if you have the time, with the idea that if it doesn't work, we can always go for the next one. But have a serious conversation. People may be coming in a sort of a multidisciplinary area where they're coming from, I usually use this journal, but actually our audience has changed so much, maybe we need to think about this other journal. That's why having an open communication and writing down why you've decided what you've decided really helps. But yeah, this is going to be an ongoing conversation with your co-authors. Okay, question 3. Is it okay to publish in a journal if one of the authors is on the editorial board? Yes, that's absolutely fine. It may need to go in your conflicts of interest, probably would need to go in your conflicts of interest. And when the article gets submitted, then it just wouldn't go to that member of the editorial board. It would go to a different person, and the decision would be made by not your co-author. But yes, in your conflicts of interest, be really clear. But it's absolutely fine. This happens a lot. Okay, last question. If only one author funder requires open access, do you have to publish open access? Yes. Yes, you do. If any of your funders requires open access, you're going to have to go open access because that funder requires it. So it trumps all the rest of the funders. Sorry about that. So you do need to think about that really early on, which is why we advocate writing your acknowledgement sections first, before you even start writing that paper. And I think that's all of the questions. So Mike, do you want to jump in?
Okay, sorry, continue, Jen.
Yeah, no, so the next webinar is going to be writing a rough draft, and it's next week, Tuesday, and we really hope to see you all there.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen, and we will sign off now, but we do look forward to hosting you again next week when we'll be looking at your rough drafts. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Goodbye now.
Bye.